اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله، بذكر الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. كتاب أنزلناه إليك مبارك ليدبروا آياته وليتذكر أولو الألباب. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, before I begin, it's an honor and a privilege to be serving the community during the nights of Muharram, the nights of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. The aspect of congregating and lamenting collectively as a community for Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, this is an ancient practice that goes all the way back to the times of the Imam alayhi salam. And a practice that has survived over the centuries shows the magnitude and the spirituality that is infused in the remembrance of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. We pray to Allah to give us the tawfiq to use these nights and these days to create a change within our lives, to develop a relationship with Abi Abdullah and in turn Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In tonight's discussion and in the following nights, although it may seem that the topics are separate in nature, there are certain points within these topics which are very, very important for us to realize and understand. And that is to understand that the paradigm that is presented by the religion of Islam, the worldview or the Islamic worldview, is a superior worldview in comparison to all of the different worldviews and philosophies that is presented by society. And it has been pervasive, it has been superior for many, many centuries. And I'll show you examples in the coming lectures as to how superior the Islamic paradigm is, especially when it is mentioned in the Holy Quran, as well as something that has been elaborated by the Ahlul-bayt alayhim as-salam. And in tonight's discussion, we begin with the examination of what exactly is the human being. You see, when we speak about the aql of the human being, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes this very, very clear, that when you examine the aql of the human being, the intellect, the power of reason, it's very much different compared to anything else that has been created. In fact, it is the distinguishing factor of the human being in comparison to the angels, in comparison to the animals. The reason being is because the power of reason, the power of the intellect, allows the human being to actually make spiritual good choices in their lives or to make disastrous choices in their lives. Something which the animals do not have that capacity and the angels don't have that capacity. So the human being, as it stands, the human being has the capacity to ascend to a stage loftier than the mightiest of angels, or he can fall to a position that is lower than the beasts of the world. Now, when you refer to the Holy Quran, Allah speaks about the Quran in a very interesting way. He says that this is a book that has been sent down to you, a book that is full of blessings. لِيَدَبَّرُوا آيَاتِ, that you may ponder and reflect upon its words. See, this idea of reflecting and pondering, it's exclusive for the human being. And then he goes on to say, لِيَتَذَكَّرَ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. It is so that the people who ponder and the people who reflect and the people who have the aql can actually think and remind themselves of the Creator. So when we look at the aql, the word aql comes from the root aqala. Aqala means to control. When you take an animal that is a camel, for example, an untamed camel, you place the reins around its mouth, its nose, and so on and so forth, and you're able to control that camel. You're able to tame it. That's the meaning of aql. Within the Islamic paradigm, what does that mean? It means that the human being as it stands, the human being is infused with the power of imagination, with the power of desire, with the power of anger. The human being, because he has been endowed with the intellect, he is able to use that intellect to control his desires, to control his anger, to control his imagination, so that he may turn his perception, he may turn he is able to turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to enhance that relationship he has with Allah. So through the aql, you find that the human being is able to understand truth from falsehood. The human being is able to understand right from wrong. The human being is able to understand what is correct and what is incorrect. The human being is able to understand all of these different realities that he engages with on a daily basis. Beyond that, the aql allows the human being to understand what is true. When you look at our aqidah, for example, the usul ad-din. The usul ad-din is an individual responsibility that we all have. And we must all understand why we believe in Tawheed. If someone was to ask you a question and say, well, why do you believe that there is one God? Have you interacted with God to know that there is only one? For all you know, there could be no God. For all you know, there could be multiple gods. This is where the aql comes in. This is where the power of reasoning steps in and tells you that, no, wait, hold on a second. I have thought about it logically. I've used common sense and I've come to the conclusion that there is one God. And it's impossible for there to be multiple gods. Likewise, it doesn't make sense when there is no God or to believe that there is no God. So this is the power of the aql. The aql steps in and allows you to understand that Tawheed is a perfect concept that has been presented to the human being. It makes sense at the end of the day. Through the aql, when a person understands that there is a God, you realize that, hold on a second, this God, he has also certain characteristics that are mandated. He has to have these characteristics. Likewise, there are certain characteristics which God cannot have. Slowly, step by step, using reasoning, using the aql, the intellect, you can form a concept of Tawheed, the paradigm of Tawheed that has been presented within the Holy Quran. And you know what the beautiful aspect behind this is? Whenever the Quran speaks about Tawheed, whenever it speaks about Tawheed, it always correlates, it always confirms what the aql comes towards, or what the aql confirms. Never will you come across a verse within the Holy Quran where Allah speaks about Tawheed, but then at the end of the day you turn to yourself saying, you know what, that doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. You'll never come across a verse like that. By extension, you find that the words of the Ahlul-bayt alayhim as-salam, when they speak about Tawheed, you look at, for example, the khutbah of Fadak of Bibi Fatima az-Zahra alayhi as-salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Her sermon of Fadak was, it's remarkable. 18 years. She lived in this world for 18 years. The words that she uses in her khutbah, when she challenges her authority in her time, they are the same words that were used by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam 6 generations later. An 18-year-old woman who was raised in the midst of the Muslim empire during the time of her father. These Muslims that converted to Islam, they were still children. Ideologically, theologically, they didn't know much about the religion of Islam, especially about Tawheed. Yet the words that she uses explains to us that she had a profound understanding of Tawheed. When you look at the sermon of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, when you look at the sermon of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, when you look at the sermon of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam in Nahj al-Balagha, the first sermon, when he begins to expand on the concept of Tawheed, it tells you that their understanding of Tawheed was something completely different. You look at Nahj al-Balagha as an example. It's a very complex book. It's a very, very complex book. The words that the Imam uses is very, very difficult. Yet if you were to take sentence by sentence and you break it down, you expand on what exactly the Imam is referring to, and this, it takes a scholar to do this, you realize that whatever the Imam is saying correlates what the intellect says as well. Never will you come across a time where you say to yourself, you know what, the teachings of the Ahlul-bayt, they don't make sense to me, especially when it comes to Tawheed. So once you frame or once you develop Tawheed according to the intellect and the reasoning, then you can move on to Nabuwah. Then you can move on to the other aspects of the Usul-e-Din. So the power of the intellect is that it allows you to develop your theology, it allows you to develop your ideology from the roots. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Hence Imam al-Qadim has a beautiful statement. He says every human being, every single individual has two imams. There is the external and there is the internal. The external are the prophets and the Ahlul-bayt that have been sent to guide. But then the internal is the aql of the human being, the intellect of the human being. When truth is identified, aql allows you to identify the truth. When truth is identified, then the next step is to submit to the truth. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. When you understand that there is something that is considered to be true, and you turn your back and you walk away from it, that act in itself is dismissive. It's dispraised amongst what's conventionally known in society. If you know something to be harmful for you, and you go ahead and you consume it or you act according to it, it doesn't make sense for you to do that. That's when the desire kicks in and makes you want to commit that particular act. But the aql tells you that you should refrain and abstain from this. Likewise, when something is true and it's good for you and it nurtures you spiritually and physically and so on and so forth, the aql tells you to interact with it. For you to walk away from it doesn't make sense. So when you look at, for example, the example of Abu Dharr al-Ghafari. Abu Dharr al-Ghafari, one of the most remarkable characters or remarkable companions of the Holy Prophet of Islam. They say one day as he was, they say he came from the tribe of Ghaffar, which was not too far from the city of Medina, just in the outskirts of Medina. Being part of this tribe, he had a job, and that job was to look after the temple. Now the temple accommodated one of the biggest idols that they worship by the name of Manat. The Quran speaks about this. Allat wal Uzza wal Manat. Manat was one of the idols that they worshipped. He was one of the security guards in the temple. So as he was just walking in the premises, he saw an old man, an old beggar, come towards the idol. And he presented the idol with some food and some drink. Milk or yogurt, according to the narrations, whatever it is. He came and he placed the bowl just beside the idol. He did his dua, whatever he did, and then he left. Now Abu Dharr is narrating. He says that when I saw this milk that was placed alongside Manat, I saw a fox come towards the milk, he sniffed the milk, and then he drank from it. So now this drink that is been presented to the idol, that is for the idol, is now being drunk by the fox. He said, later I saw the fox leave, and then he came back, and when it came back, it urinated on Manat. And I said to myself, well, hold on a second, how is that even possible? This is a God that we worship, thinking that it's the all-powerful, that has all the authority, and yet it is urinated by a fox, urinated upon by a fox. It says it can't even protect itself. It depends on us to protect it. Because that didn't make sense to him, he then abandons his religion of polytheism, and he hears about the Holy Prophet of Islam who has just initiated his message in Mecca. So he migrates to Mecca and he begins to speak with the Prophet. In just a few conversations that he has with the Prophet, understanding what the message of the Holy Prophet is, he submits to the religion of Islam. Internally, there was a change that was taking place. Intellectually, he started asking certain key questions and he found that the Prophet had answers, and therefore he followed the Holy Prophet's message. When he identified the truth, he submitted to it. In contrast, you have the likes of Abu Jahl, and you have the likes of Walid ibn Mughira. There's a very interesting conversation that takes place between the two. They met up privately. Walid turns to Abu Jahl and he says to him, Ya Abu Jahl, tell me, what do you think of the message of your nephew? Abu Jahl responds, he says, I believe it's true. I believe it's true. He says, with regards to the Quran, I accept its profundity. But I can't believe that the Quran was given to a man like him. We are much more deserving of it. So not only did he accept the authority of the Holy Quran, he also accepted the message of the Prophet. So Walid tells Abu Jahl, he says, don't you dare say this in public. He says, I know what my responsibilities are. These words will never be uttered in public. But I can assure you, deep down, I do accept his message. It's just that I can't see myself sitting on the same level as the slaves of Arabia. That's where the desire and the arrogance kicks in, which opposes. It's an exact dichotomy against the aql of the human being. That's why Imam Sadiq alayhi salam mentions, he says, with regards to the aql, ma ubida bihi ar-Rahman waqtusiba bihi al-jinan. He says, through the aql, the human being can understand what is true, and you can therefore worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Through the aql dictates that Allah is to be worshipped. And then he says that when one worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the outcome is that he will be given Jannah. It's when Jannah is earned. All of this through the aql and the power of the aql. Now there's a question, or this gives rise to a question, and it's a very, very interesting question. Something that affects each and every single one of us. And the question is, what role does the aql play within our lives? To what extent do I rely on my aql? I know that intellect and the power of reasoning is powerful and the profundity is there within the Quran and within the narrations. But how far can I rely on my aql? And there are two profound answers to this question. The first, which has been answered by secular society, and the second, which has been answered by the religion of Islam. With regards to secular society, when they look at the power of reasoning and the intellect of the human being, they say that there is absolute authority that is given to the aql. Now this is a movement that started about 200, 250 years ago. You can go into the history as to where it developed, Eastern Europe, for example. This is where it all developed, how it expanded in the world, and so on and so forth. But the conclusion was that the aql has the greatest priority. When the aql has been given priority, the conclusion of which is that if you want to know what is real and what's not real, you refer to the aql. And the aql dictates, or the aql tells you, that what is real is physical and only tangible. Beyond that, nothing else exists. So if you can see it, you can hear it, you can sense it, you can smell it, you can taste it, it's real. Otherwise, it's not real. By extension, when you look at, for example, the advances in technology and science, you're able to now see certain things which the naked eye cannot see. So you can take certain equipments and you can go into the atomic levels of certain things and you can see how it interacts with certain things, right? You can see it on a molecular level, which the naked eye cannot see. So this is the extension of it. If it's observable, if it is seen through technological aid, then it exists. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. So when we speak about the angels, say it doesn't exist. When we speak about the jinn, it doesn't exist. Why doesn't it exist? Because you can't interact with it, you can't see it, you can't observe it. Reward, heaven and hell, punishment, none of that exists simply because you cannot interact with it. So when you bring in the question, what about God? Why is it that people refute the whole concept of the existence of God? The reason is because, hey, I can't see God. I can't hear Him. I can't touch Him and feel Him the way I can interact with you. And because I cannot interact with Him on a physical level, it doesn't exist. Does it make sense? Now, very interestingly, when it comes to seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this has always been in our tradition. Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam was approached by a man by the name of Qasim Dawood ibn Qasim al-Ja'fari. He turns to Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam, he says this ayah in the Holy Quran, وَلَا يُدْرِكُهُ الْأَبْصَارِ, that the eyes can never perceive him. He says, what's the tafsir of this? He says, Ya Dawood, forget the eyes, the imagination of the human being can never perceive him. The imagination of the human being cannot perceive him. It says your imagination that's there in your mind, that's far more profound than what your eyes can see. It says, standing here before me, you can imagine that you're in India, for example, Al-Hind. Today, for example, we're all sitting here in this hall. If we speak about Karbala, for those of you who've been, you could imagine yourself standing in front of the Haram of the Imam alayhi salam. For those of you who've been for Hajj, you can imagine yourself being in front of the Kaaba. You're not there physically, but your imagination is so powerful, it's as if you can see it in your mind. It says, Ya Dawood, your imagination is so profound, it's much more profound than what your eyes can see. Yet your imagination is deficient when it comes to understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Amir al-Mu'mineen was asked, what is Tawheed? He says, Tawheed, la tatawahham. Do not imagine. The imagination doesn't have the power to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is beyond our imagination, let alone our senses. So coming back to the values preserved by secular society, that none of this exists, none of these non-physical entities exist simply because they're non-physical. Think of it from a different perspective. How do we learn? How do we acquire knowledge? We acquire knowledge either by reading or by listening or by writing or whatever it is. It falls within the fabrics of the five senses. If it's not within the fabrics of the five senses, can a person acquire knowledge? Not really, no. Is there a way for you to acquire knowledge without tasting it or feeling it or listening or reading or anything like that? A person can't. According to the Islamic paradigm, you can. And we'll speak about this in the coming nights. But according to the secular paradigm, you cannot gain knowledge if it's outside of the five senses. Likewise, existence does not exist if you cannot see it physically or feel it or sense it. Anything that falls within the paradigm of the five senses, within the fabrics of the five senses. Now, Islam comes forward and has an objection towards this. So you find that scholars have objected to this from the very beginning. And there are plenty of objections, but there are two major ones. The first one is, there are certain very important questions that we all come through within our lives, which the aql does not have answers to. Regardless of how profound the aql is, regardless of how much we advance in society from a scientific perspective, these answers can never be found to certain questions, certain philosophical questions. For example, why do I exist? What's the purpose of my existence? How much technology you have in your hands, it doesn't matter. You'll never be able to answer this question. What happens after I die? Where do I go? Will I be rewarded for my good? Will I be punished for my bad? Secular society has not been able to answer this question. They've used evolution, for those of you who've understood this, they've used evolution as a caveat to try and answer some of these questions, but they've failed. They've fallen on their faces trying to answer these very pertinent questions. If I look at a human being, for example, someone who is vicious, someone who has committed the most heinous of crimes, we've had many despots and dictators in history. They have killed millions. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I see a person who is good, a person who is a philanthropist, a person who has given everything he has for the sake of others, a person who has given his own life to preserve the lives of others. Are you telling me that the end of both is exactly the same? That they will both go into nothingness? The way I came from nothingness, the way we were before we were born? It doesn't make sense. Nothing fits in. Then what's the whole point of being good and abstaining from being bad? So the first objection that we have is that there are certain key questions that we ask at certain times within our lives, and we need answers to these questions, which secular values is unable to give me. The second objection, and this is also a profound objection, is that as human beings, we have been programmed to seek perfection. We all yearn and desire perfection. What is perfection? What is perfect? We all have different desires and different aspirations. We all have different goals. We all want to do and achieve certain things in life. We all have different skill sets. And this is a bias in us understanding what exactly is perfect. If you ask a sociologist what is perfection, he'll tell you his understanding of perfection. A philosopher, what is perfection, he'll give you his answer. A biologist, he'll give you his answer. A person who is old, he will tell you what is perfection. A person who is young, he will tell you his understanding of perfection. And because we are all separate human beings, and we all have our separate minds, our understanding and our perception of perfection is very different, which doesn't make sense. When you look at a politician, for example, a person who has power, a person who has the power to govern and rule, he will try and nurture his society according to his understanding of perfection. And when you look at history, every kingdom, every civilization has risen and they have fallen. They have translated their understanding of perfection upon society and they have failed. Each and every single one of them has failed. They ruled for a while, then they dissipated. And this is the trend in history. So what's the concept of perfection? What's the idea of perfection? What is considered to be perfect? Because secular society have not been able to answer these two objections, you find that the religion of Islam through the Quran answers all of these key questions. You see, what the Quran is saying is that although the aql is profound, although the aql is great in nature, it is limited, it is deficient. It can only take you so far. When it does take you that far, this is when you need revelation to feed you other forms of information. Revelation being Quran, likewise the Ahlul-bayt alayhim as-salam. The aql can only take us so far. For us to then go the extra mile, we are in need of revelation. So revelation steps in and tells us that there is a form of perfection, there is a way in seeking perfection, there is a method in seeking perfection likewise. Perfection is not limited to just the physical world. It goes beyond the physical. It incorporates the spiritual nature of the human being, the emotional nature of the human being, the psychological nature of the human being. The cultivation of all of these is what is known as perfection. So when you observe the Quran from the very beginning tells you that this world is not just a world that is limited to the physical. Rather, there is a spiritual reality behind everything that is physical. Everything that has been created, there is a spiritual entity associated with it. يُسَبِّحُ لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Everything between the heavens and the earth glorify Allah, engages in the tasbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ. Allah says, if you think that this is just metaphorical, here in Surah Al-Isra, He tells us, He says, وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ. Everything engages in the tasbih of Allah, it engages in the tasbih of Allah. Literally, it's just that you as the human being, you do not have the capacity to understand what form of tasbih they are engaging in. Because you are limited as a human being. Your aql can only take you so far. The sands, the bricks, the carpet, everything that has been brought into existence engages in the tasbih of Allah. It's just that you don't understand their tasbih. When you look at the human being likewise, the human being has a physical, but then also has a spiritual aspect to his creation. Physically, it's the body. Spiritually, it's the ruh. When Allah speaks of Nabi Adam alayhi salam, He says, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. I blew into him my ruh. So there is the physical body and there is the spiritual nature of the human being. Both of them together creates what? It creates the nafs. The nafs, some people ask the question, what is the nafs? The difference between the nafs and the ruh. The ruh is an entity, a non-physical entity that is part of the body. The combination of the body and the soul is what is known as the nafs. The role of the aql is to control the nafs. That's why within our traditions, likewise within the Quran, you have the fluctuations of the nafs. You have something which is known as an-nafsul ammara. An-nafsul ammara bis-su'. The nafs which guides the human being towards evil. Why evil? Because the aql has not been able to control the nafs. It's not been able to tame the nafs. Then you have, for example, an-nafsul lawama. The nafs which is always in the state of regret. It's fluctuating. It wants to be better. This is when the aql can actually tame the nafs to become better. Then you have something which is known as an-nafsul mutma'in, when the nafs has been tamed fully, controlled by the aql. When you look at the human being, you find that as human beings, we are drawn and pulled in all different directions. Our desires pull us in one direction. Our anger pulls us in another. Our imagination pulls us towards a third direction. It is the aql of the human being that tames all of these different characteristics so that we can become spiritually better. How do we tame the nafs? Through the sharia. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to us, you as a human being, you're weak, you don't know what is perfect. I'm telling you what perfection is. Follow the guidelines and you will seek perfection. You will see it within your life. As I said, the aql can only take us so far. Sometimes we are in need. In fact, we are in need of revelation to tell us what's good for us and what's not. There is an assumption that we've developed as human beings, living in secular society. When it comes to the sharia, certain aspects which are considered to be haram, certain aspects which are considered to be wajib, there is a question we ask. Does it make sense? The assumption that we've created is, yes, it has to make sense for me to believe in it and for me to submit towards it. If it doesn't make sense, then there is no need for me to adhere to it. That works when you and I interact with one another. The laws that we create, they have to make sense. There is a reasoning behind why each and every single law exists within our societies. But that interaction doesn't exist with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why is that? Because the aql is deficient. When Allah ascertains a law and He commands something to be done, He tells us that it's good for you as a human being, not just on a physical level, but on an emotional level, on a spiritual level. That if you were to observe it, it affects the people around you, it affects your families. And if families were to observe certain laws, it will nurture society as a whole. Then you will see the fruition behind the establishment of certain laws. When it comes to our interaction with Allah, we find this within the narrations, it's absolute submission. No questions asked. Because Allah is operating at a different level that is beyond the power of reasoning of the human being. So we refer to the Quran to tell us what to do and what not to do, and we refer to the Ahlul-bayt what to do and what not to do. When it comes to the movement of Aba Abdullah alayhi salam, and what happened on the 10th of Muharram, from the very beginning, the Imam makes it clear that this movement is not a physical movement, it's more so a spiritual movement. The sacrifice, and he knew of this, he knew that his sacrifice will lead to a spiritual revolution that will be remembered for years to come. Walid ibn Utbah has been given a letter from Yazid. Give me the allegiance of Aba Abdullah alayhi salam. Force him to pay allegiance. If he does not, then execute him. Now Walid knows the status of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And he knows his position in Medina. And that's not something that he can do very easily. He consults Marwan ibn Hakim. He says, Marwan, what do you think about this? He says, well, look, the order has been given. Force Aba Abdullah alayhi salam to give you bay'ah, otherwise kill him. He summons the Imam alayhi salam. The Imam meets with Abdullah ibn Zubair. He has a chat with Abdullah ibn Zubair and then he heads towards the governor's mansion. He takes 19 members of his family, Abu Fadl al-Abbas, his brothers, Aliyun al-Akbar, Imam al-Sajjad, they all go towards the mansion. Before they enter, the Imam tells them, he says, stay here. I'll go inside, I'll have a word with them. The moment you hear my voice being raised, then enter with the swords in your hands. So the Imam alayhi salam enters. When he enters, there's a dialogue that takes place between Walid and the Imam alayhi salam. Walid demands that the Imam give bay'ah. And the Imam flat out refuses. He says, a person like me will never give allegiance to a person like him. And the way the Imam said it angered and infuriated Marwan ibn Hakim. So Marwan ibn Hakim, they say that he stood up with the sword in his hands and he was shouting his head off to Walid. He said to Walid, Walid, before he leaves this mansion, before he leaves this room, force the bay'ah, otherwise kill him and execute him. Now when he shouted and he raised his voice, the Imam responded. And when the Imam responded, Abu Fadl al-Abbas, Aliyun al-Akbar and his brothers and all of them, they entered the mansion with the swords in their hands and they circled Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And Imam al-Hussein, when he was circled by his family, he then said something very interesting. He says, Ya Marwan, Inna Ahlul-bayt nubuwa. We are from the household of the Holy Prophet. وَمَعْدِنُ الرِّسَالَةِ. We are a household upon which revelation has come towards. وَمَعْدِنُ الرِّسَالَةِ وَمُخْتَلِفِ الْمَلَائِكَةِ. We are a household upon whom the angels used to descend. بِنَا فَتَحَ اللَّهِ. Through us, Allah has brought things into creation. وَبِنَا خُتِمْ. And through us, everything will cease to exist. This is the position of the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam. Then he goes on to say, he says, Yazid rajulun fasiqun sharib al-khamr. This is a person who is an open sinner, a person who engages in intoxications. A person like me will never give allegiance to a person like Yazid. From the very beginning, he makes it clear that this battle that Yazid is now proposing is not a physical tribal battle. It is a battle against spirituality, which Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam was very much prepared to preserve. The Ahlul-bayt step in and they say that when it comes to our interactions with the martyrdom of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, at least a person should cry and weep. For a person to engage with Imam al-Hussein, the person should weep. If a person cannot weep, pretend to weep. As the words were mentioned by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Very interestingly, you find the narrations are plentiful in this regard. The one who weeps for Abu Abdullah, spiritually the person goes through a change. His sins are forgiven. He can understand where he is standing when it comes to his loyalty towards the Ahlul-bayt or towards other philosophies that are presented by societies. The time of Muharram is the time when we should engage and reconnect with Abi Abdullah. Rayyan ibn Shabib, he enters the presence of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam. And the Imam says to him, Ya Rayyan, if you were to weep, then weep over my grandfather Abi Abdullah, for he was slaughtered the way a sheep was slaughtered. Ad-Da'bal al-Khuzai, when he enters the presence of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam, the Imam creates a platform for him. He sits and he says, Ya Da'bal, engage in the eulogies and speak about my grandfather. Da'bal begins, and these are profound words that he speaks of. He begins, he says, Mudarisun ayatin khalat min tilawatin ومنزل وحي مكفر العرصات لآل رسول الله بالخيف من منى وبالبيت والتعريف والجمرات. He begins to speak and he begins to remember the Ahlul-bayt one after the other. Then he reaches Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and he begins to speak with Fatima al-Zahra. He says, Fatimu law khilt al-Hussein mujaddila وقد مات طشانا بشط فرات. He says, Ya Fatima, if you saw how Hussein had fallen thirsty, slaughtered alongside the river Furat, إذا للتمت خد فاطمة عنده وأجريت دمع العين في الوجنات. He says, surely you would have slapped your face and your cheeks, and your tears would flow from your eyes. أفاتم قومي وابنة الخير واندبي نجوم السماوات بالأرض فلا تن. Ya Fatima, rise and weep and lament for your son Abi Abdullah. For the stars in the heavens have scattered alongside, have scattered on the barren lands. Abu Hamza Thumali, Abu Hamza Thumali, he approaches Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. Imam Zainul Abidin, he's asked, he said, why do you cry constantly? It's been 34 years, you cry for your father. Should you not move on? He says, Shakar Allahu sa'yaka ya Aba Hamza. He says, may Allah bless you, Ya Aba Hamza. Lamma waqa'tu aynaya ala ammati wa akhawati illa wa dhakartu firarahunna yawma ashura min khaymatin ila khayma حتى ينادي المنادي احرقوا بيوت الظالمين. He says, Ya Aba Hamza, what hurt the most on the 10th of Muharram was seeing my women. Whenever I see my aunt or my daughters, whenever I see my aunts and my sisters, all I can think about was what happened on the 10th of Muharram, when they fled and they escaped from one tent towards another until the horsemen came towards us and said, burn the houses of Ali Muhammad. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون.
Amen.